rights are human rights.
Rishi Sunak put his Rwanda policy at the heart of his premiership. Many think it may have been killed off here in the Supreme Court. A unanimous judgment that Rwanda can't be trusted to treat asylum seekers properly.
The changes needed to eliminate the risk of refoulement may be delivered in the future, but they have not been shown to be in place now. The Home Secretary's appeal is therefore dismissed.
The Supreme Court justices unanimously judged that asylum seekers deported to Rwanda might be sent back to the country they'd escaped. Refoulement in the legal jargon. The judgment said it was based on evidence of a dismissive attitude towards some asylum seekers inside Rwanda. There was a real risk that asylum claims will not be determined properly in Rwanda. And they said Rwanda needs to appreciate its current approach is inadequate. A change of attitudes is needed, and effective training and monitoring.
The Supreme Court gave a judgment on the Rwanda plan. They confirmed that the principle of removing asylum seekers to a safe third country is lawful. There are further elements that they want additional certainty on, and noted that changes can be delivered in the future to address those issues. The government has been working already on a new treaty with Rwanda, and we will finalise that in light of today's judgment. And furthermore, if necessary, I am prepared to revisit our domestic legal frameworks.
His Rwanda scheme, cooked up with his National Security Threat Home Secretary, has blown up. He was told over and over again that this would happen, that it wouldn't work, and it was just the latest Tory gimmick. But he bet everything on it, and now he's totally exposed. The central pillar of his government has crumbled beneath him.
The Home Secretary he sacked on Monday is part of a chorus of voices from the right of the Conservative Party outraged at the court's judgment. Suella Braverman tweeted, "There is not a chance of curbing illegal migration within the current legal framework. We must legislate or admit defeat."
Ultimately, we'll need to see, of course, what the Prime Minister says, but this is a confidence issue for my voters in me. By the same token, it is a confidence issue for me in the Prime Minister.
Justice for refugees!
Downing Street said there'd be a press conference responding to the Supreme Court judgment later in the afternoon. Around Westminster, the calls for a harder line on Rwanda continued.
So we need an Act of Parliament that absolutely specifies the primacy of Parliament, and the will of the people shall be done in this respect.
You want something more drastic than the last cabinet was willing to do under Rishi Sunak, and you were standing in this very spot yesterday saying the new one looks a bit soft to you, a bit retro, not at all hard line.
Well, let's see.
So what are the chances of that?
They need to respond to what's just happened this morning.
We very much hope that the government does have a credible plan B that involves categorical legislation that shows that UK Parliament is sovereign.
We'll have to clear the decks, and this will have to be the issue that goes through ahead of anything else in the King's speech. If he's going to put legislation down, it literally has to be run through the House at pace.
Suella Braverman says he's not that kind of guy.
Well, you know, that's her view. All I say is that this is Rishi Sunak defines who he is.
In Downing Street, the Prime Minister's team seemed to be moving at speed onto party critics' terrain they'd long resisted.
Good afternoon. We need to end the merry-go-round. I said I was going to fundamentally change our country, and I meant it. So I'm also announcing today that we will take the extraordinary step of introducing emergency legislation. This will enable Parliament to confirm that with our new treaty, Rwanda is safe. It will ensure that people cannot further delay flights by bringing systemic challenges in our domestic courts and stop our policy being repeatedly blocked. Let me tell everybody now, I will not allow a foreign court to block these flights. If the Strasbourg court chooses to intervene against the expressed wishes of Parliament, I am prepared to do what is necessary to get flights off.
Rishi Sunak said MPs would vote on a treaty with Rwanda and a bill declaring it safe, effectively overriding the judgment of the Supreme Court. Quite how he goes about rejecting the judgments of the Strasbourg court isn't clear, but it's a challenge he's set himself.
Well, Gary is with me now here in Central Lobby. Gary, are you any clearer what exactly the Prime Minister is proposing?
Not massively. I can help a bit, I hope. There is definitely an intention to put together a treaty with Rwanda, which the government says will satisfy a lot of the concerns of the Supreme Court. And they have a concern that the Supreme Court has been working on old material, as it were, sort of judgments about the progress in Rwanda in aspic. And they reckon that they're behind the times, basically, about all the improvements that have happened in Rwanda. And where they aren't behind the times, those improvements can happen very quickly. The other bit of legislation, though, the emergency legislation that they're talking about, is something that would decree, basically, that the Supreme Court is wrong. It would say Rwanda is safe. And it might seem odd, but under our Constitution, Parliament, even though the Supreme Court has just said something is black, they can turn around and say, actually, black is white. And the Supreme Court might actually have to obey that, and that would be the deemed law. So we have that sort of massive complication, but that's not the emergency legislation that that the right-wing members of the Conservative Party I was talking to have been hoping for. They were hoping for something that would derogate from those rights in international law that have been written into British law. And that hasn't been clearly laid out. We've got a signal from David Cameron that's something sorry, he's the from Rishi Sunak. It's been a busy week. From Rishi Sunak, that's the sort of direction he would be interested in travelling. But we haven't had a clear promise to do that. He's saying, more or less, if there is a plane on the runway by the spring of next year, he will instruct it chocks away, even if there's an appeal going on to the Strasbourg court. Well, if he's really going down that route, we are beginning on the journey, probably, of leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, you would think, but he hasn't actually committed to that. So a lot of confusion around on the later stages of this entire policy. I mentioned David Cameron there. I mean, it has been a busy week, but the news cycles that Rishi Sunak lives in are very short. The David Cameron reshuffle, as it were, gave him a sort of 12-hour shine. You got 1.5 hours in the news cycle out of the inflation rate being halved, meeting his pledge from January for now, at least. Who knows how long he'll actually get a shine out of this, but he's hoping that those words, emergency legislation, will satisfy people, make them feel that he's moving in the right direction. Actually, how he delivers it is a lot more complicated.
Indeed, Gary, thanks very much. Well, Laura Farris has just been made a Home Office Minister in the reshuffle. Gary was talking about that short news cycle. And I spoke to her a short time ago and asked what the Prime Minister meant when he said he was prepared to do what's necessary to get flights off the ground.
Well, I just listened to his statement, and what I think that means is that he is looking really carefully at what the Supreme Court said, the reason why the government lost its case today, and that was specifically on the issue of refoulement, which is the risk that individuals who were moved to Rwanda might be repatriated to their country of origin before their claim had been determined. And he was going to conclude a new treaty with Rwanda which would deal specifically with that point, and then put emergency legislation before Parliament to be debated in the usual way and then subject to a vote.
But will he withdraw from the European Convention of Human Rights as a last resort? Will he override that, as he's being pushed to do?
Well, that's certainly not his starting point. His starting point is to tackle the main issue why the government lost its case, and that was the refoulement problem, which was the focus for the Supreme Court today. And he thinks that he can do that by negotiating a new treaty with Rwanda. New obligations will exist, I don't know what they are, and then putting that in the form of emergency legislation. So taking primary legislation as the route. But yes, look, he did follow up by saying that if there was a reference made to Strasbourg, he would not let a foreign court override what we were doing, and he referred to what the purpose of the European Convention on Human Rights was. So that was part of his speech
he would
too.
Potentially, as a last resort, be prepared to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights?
I don't think we're going to get to that point because of what he said he would do first, but yes, he intimated that. And I think what you can take from that is probably consistent with other things that have been said, which is when you look at the fact, for example, that UNHCR already has a refugee program in Rwanda, it is not right to say that refugees can't be kept safe in Rwanda. So I think he wants to answer very specifically the issues that were adjudicated by the court. I think he wants to round them off and create robust protections and then put that back before Parliament.
But what he wants to do, to be clear, is, the Supreme Court says that Rwanda is not safe. He wants to just declare it safe in UK law. That's the kind of thing that Belarus would do.
No, that's not right. That's not right, Kathy. The first question is it lawful, under all our obligations under international law, to remove somebody to a safe third country? And the Supreme Court has said that it is.
Yeah, in principle.
The second question is Rwanda as a generality a country where people can live? And they didn't deal with that point. The focus and the reason why the government lost the case was because of this issue. We use it in immigration law, the expression refoulement, because at the heart of the Refugee Convention is the non-refoulement principle. In other words, somebody saying that they are fleeing war, fleeing a place of persecution, can't be returned to that country while their claim's being adjudicated.
But so Rwanda is unsafe because of its use of that law.
Because of the risk of that. Yeah. And so he's looking to cover that off rather than simply, and there are ways, of course, that you could create robust protections. He says nobody will be at risk. I think I'll come up with the language he used because he didn't use the expression, but he said nobody will be at risk of being sent back. So there will be a mechanism, clearly new provisions that will be implemented to achieve that will then be put before Parliament and we will debate it in the normal way.
You're going to try and do a deal with Rwanda that is a treaty.
A treaty.
Yeah, but you're overriding...
But it won't be a replication of what it currently exists, because in fact the Supreme Court, if you read the concluding paragraphs of their judgment, what they said is it may be possible to get to a point where Rwanda would be able to get all these protections in place, but they're not there yet. A treaty will require new obligations to be created, and then that will be brought before Parliament so that democratically elected people on every side of the House will have the chance to scrutinise those new arrangements, determine whether they correspond with the concerns that the Supreme Court had.
How long is all of that going to take?
Well, look, emergency legislation is unusual. The Prime Minister said as much. But you can pass it through even, both houses reasonably quickly. Look at the illegal migration bill. That was introduced into the House, I think, at the beginning of this year.
But how long are you going to take to do the treaty before you get to that point?
Well, first of all, I don't know, but one of the things that Prime Minister said more than once in his statement is that they had been preparing for this. And I think it's a reasonable assumption that quite a lot of this preparatory work has happened, because he wouldn't make a statement with that level of clarity and commitment, and he did commit himself to flights taking off in the spring if he hadn't thought of the timetable.
Right, you really think that flights will take off in the spring?
I do.
Is Rishi Sunak's leadership on the line on this? If he doesn't get this right, there'll be a challenge, because that's what the right-wingers are saying.
I completely disagree with that. The Prime Minister is safe. And he has
there are leadership letters going in, according to Andrew Jenkins.
He has the support of the vast majority of people in the parliamentary party. I think Andrew Jenkins is an outlier, and he's going to lead us into the next election.
Suella Braverman an outlier as well?
Look, I know that she's been critical. I read her letter yesterday. I don't agree with the contents of her letter, but I don't think that's a matter for me.
But do you think the Prime Minister's scared of her? Because, he's moved quite a way today, isn't he? He's dangled the prospect of the European Convention on Human Rights, withdrawing from that.
I don't think he's scared of her, no, I don't. And I don't think he said anything today that wasn't prepared for. And actually, it's not some sort of surprising process. The Court of Appeal, when they heard the matter, split, as you'll recall. The Lord Chief Justice found for the government, two other very senior justices found differently. It was always a finely balanced, difficult issue, and refoulement was always the question for the court. And so I think this work has been in the making, in preparation for every eventuality, because as he said in his statement, I said I would stop the boats and I meant it.
Is Suella Braverman a liar then?
I'm not saying she's a liar, but she has a disagreement with the Prime Minister that's separate to this.
Laura Farris, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, the Shadow Science and Technology Secretary Peter Kyle joins me now. Peter Kyle, can I take it that you would vote against this treaty that the Prime Minister is drawing up with Rwanda and this emergency legislation? You vote against the lot.
Well, we have to see it, but this is it's a complete red herring. The idea that he's going to come out with a treaty now and get it through Parliament fast, over the House of Lords, he hasn't thought about this. He's just literally trying to say something to distract from what happened today. Rishi Sunak's signature policy has just been shot down in flames by our own Supreme Court. It's not lawful in our own country, let alone against all of the treaties which we signed with the UN and other international treaties, such as not being compliant with the United Nations Convention on Torture. So, it's been shot down, it hasn't worked, it's been very, very expensive. Only 100 people could have ever been eligible to go on this scheme in the first place.
But the principle has not been shot down because the Supreme Court accepted the principle of sending asylum seekers to third countries that were safe. Now, Austria, Germany, Denmark, Italy are all exploring sending asylum seekers to third countries. If it's good enough for them, why not for you, the opposition?
The government revealed in court, in one of the other court sessions, that only 100 asylum seekers were eligible to do this in any 1 year. We have spent £140 million. This is a complete distraction from actually what will solve the problem. We have a plan.
But that's not an answer to my question, though. In principle, would you ever, in government, contemplate doing what the government is trying to do and what governments in other European countries are trying to do?
We would never contemplate sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. It is expensive.
No, I'm not talking about Rwanda, I'm talking about other countries. Albania, for example.
It is expensive, it doesn't work. This scheme has been proven to be unlawful. What we have a plan,
You're answering
Kathy.
a question I didn't ask. Other European countries are exploring sending asylum seekers to third countries. Is that something you would contemplate
Kathy,
in government?
we have a plan that involves using the money that the government are wasting currently on the Rwanda plan. We will make sure that we have a national crime agency task force that will get the gangs, that we will make sure that we can have a returns policy where they exist. We'll have tighten our cooperation with Europe so that we can work in tandem with it, and we will end the use of hotels and use that money to make sure we can have 1,000 new people processing these asylum cases. So we have a functioning system that works quickly and swiftly, is fair, but make sure we can stop the boats and end the use of hotels.
But it's out of the question that you'd look at doing what Germany's doing, for example, using a third country. Doesn't need it,
right? Our fully
okay.
funded plan doesn't need that, so why would we use it if we don't need it?
Okay. Well, you heard the division bell just a minute ago. There's a key vote taking place on Gaza and calls for an immediate ceasefire. It's an SNP motion that quite a few of your frontbenchers are voting with. 2 have resigned in the Commons today. Others are presumably facing the sack, are they, for voting with the SNP?
Well, firstly, we've just had a vote before this on the Labour motion, which every single Labour MP voted for. And that is so that we recognise Israel's right to respond. We expect them to act within international law. We want the International Criminal Court to be there to make sure they are acting in a lawful way, that we can end any violence on the West Bank, and we can make sure humanitarian activity is allowed into Gaza right now. We also want to work towards cessation of violence so we can move towards a political process into the long term. That's what we are united on, and the Conservative Party voted against that.
Yeah, but just pause there for a second, because I can now bring you this result from the Commons. MPs have just voted in that Gaza vote in the Commons, rejecting Labour's humanitarian pause amendment, and now it's the next vote on the SNP amendment calling for a ceasefire, and that is the more significant vote, as it will tell us how many Labour MPs are willing to rebel against their leadership. And that is a crucial question, because we've seen people standing up in the Commons, Naz Shah, for example, absolutely demolishing Labour's policy on Gaza. I mean, Keir Starmer's authority is a serious blow to his authority on this.
No, we were united on the Labour motion. Naz Shah and everyone else voted for it. Now there are some
rival party now.
There are some exactly, and there are some people who do want to go further, and it does step outside of Labour policy. And in order to do so, they have to resign.
But Keir Starmer,
Naz Shah has not resigned. Our policy will be for Keir Starmer to stand alongside our G7 partners so we can have international coordinated pressure on Israel so that we can make sure we can get humanitarian activity in there quickly. We can work towards the release of hostages, and once that happens, we can start moving towards a peaceful resolution to this that moves towards then a political settlement that can be the only long-term settlement. So Keir Starmer and our policy hasn't changed. We are united, we're putting the country first, and we are putting the long-term challenges in the area first.
He hasn't sacked them yet, though, these MPs that have spoken in the Commons in favour of the SNP amendment. That doesn't exactly show strength, does it?
Kathy, the vote hasn't finished yet. The bells have just gone. We'll see how the vote plans out. It'll take another 5 or 6 minutes, and when that happens, of course, those people who are on the front bench, who chose to go further than Labour Party policy, will have to leave the front bench if they're on it. I mean, that's our policy. But we are united as a party on what we need to do going forward. That's not in contention.
Okay.
Keir Starmer's policy has not changed, and he stands alongside our international partners to do what is right to bring the pressure that can end this situation.
When mass graves are being dug at a hospital in Gaza, it's not surprising that many of your colleagues want an immediate ceasefire, is it?
We all want this to end, Cathy. You know,
That's not the same as an immediate ceasefire, though, is it?
What we need to do is work towards the situation where that can happen. The motion that Labour has just put forward says that we want to work towards the cessation of violence, and we're putting forward the practical measures to do so. Then what we're trying really hard to do is recognise that what is unfolding is unacceptable. Right. What is unfolding is heartbreaking. We know this, but we have to work within the realms of what is possible.
Right.
We're working alongside Joe Biden and the Biden administration, the EU, and our G7 partners to bring about the only change that will make the absolute difference on the ground.
Peter Carl, must leave it there. Thanks very much for joining us. Well, as I said, Labour is facing a significant rebellion in the Commons tonight, and the Shadow Women and Equalities Minister, Yasmin Qureshi, has already stepped down to back that SNP amendment calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Another Shadow Minister has just followed suit. So Keir Starmer had been trying to persuade potential rebels to back Labour's own amendment that you just heard Peter Carl talking about there instead. So let's get the latest from our senior political correspondent, Paul McNamara.
The chants outside Parliament tonight echoing impassioned speeches being made on the inside, regardless of the consequences.
Hospitals have been bombed, refugee camps have been bombed, United Nations schools have been bombed, ambulances bombed, which is why I urge members to back an immediate ceasefire on all sides and push for the release of hostages.
The Shadow Minister wasn't just putting her belief on the record, but her job on the line. Labour has ordered its MPs to abstain on tonight's vote for a ceasefire. Backing it means facing the sack.
Our values push us to do better, and this is why, despite all the risks to our personal positions, we must do what is right.
What the party leadership says is right, though, is humanitarian pauses to help aid reach Gaza.
Well, I think every one of us wants to see an end to the violence and the suffering as soon as possible. That's why we have called for the urgent suspension of hostilities. It's why we've also called for the action that we urgently need to protect hospitals, to make sure that civilians are protected.
That's not far enough, though, say scores of Labour MPs, including Helen Hayes, who was the second Shadow Minister to defy the party's leadership.
I have heard from thousands of my constituents who have been in contact with me over the past month to share their views. They too are completely horrified at what they are seeing, and they want to see every possible effort being made to stop the conflict. They understand that this is what is being signalled by the word ceasefire. In calling for a ceasefire, no one is suggesting that the cessation should be unilateral or that it should be without conditions. Hamas must release the hostages.
The vote for a ceasefire was tabled by the SNP, an amendment to the King's speech. Labour MPs have accused them of playing politics with Gaza. Their leader in Westminster has urged MPs to show, quote, moral leadership.
It's for others to determine whether the leader of the Labour Party lacks a moral compass in relation to this.
Do you think he has a moral compass?
Well, let's see how he votes tonight.
And if he doesn't vote for your amendment?
I think that will be a situation where history will judge Keir Starmer poorly.
Does Keir Starmer lack moral leadership?
Well, the SNP are playing politics.
They're playing politics and you've walked straight into it.
No, but they're playing politics and that's what they do. So that rhetoric, I'm not going to get involved in that rhetoric. But in regards to showing the intention of what I want to see happen, then that is why I'll be voting for a ceasefire.
So Keir Starmer's got this wrong, in your opinion?
I think Keir Starmer needs to go further.
The pressure within Labour ranks has been building for weeks. Being tested tonight, not just where they stand, but how their leader responds.
Well, earlier I spoke to one of those Labour frontbenchers, Naz Shah, who's backing calls for an immediate ceasefire. And I asked whether she was expecting to be sacked after going against the party leadership or if she'd resign.
Well, I've not done this before, so I'm not sure what happens, but I needed to make... Well, I might be a frontbencher, but I am also a human, and I also represent my constituents, and I'm also Labour through and through, and those values, which I've talked about, and as a proud Brit, our values for equality and justice and fairness are paramount to what drives me in this place, and I think that's really important for me.
How many other people feel the way you do, and how many other Labour rebels are we going to see tonight?
I think the question is, when you say feel the way I do, does everybody feel passionately about the issue of what is happening in Israel, in Palestine? Absolutely. There is nobody in this place that doesn't. They feel very passionately about it. How many will vote? I don't know how many people I've managed to convince with that speech. I'd like to think I managed to convince the government. I'm not going to hold my breath on that, but that's what I'd like to think.
But when you sign up to a front bench role, you've got to toe the party line, and you've just flouted that.
And it's the first time I've done it, which has not been an easy decision in terms of not staying with the party, but it's not a hard decision when it comes to a humanitarian catastrophe either.
So it was a moral imperative?
For me, it was absolute moral. For me, it was for my measuring yardstick of my passion and my seeking justice and seeking the protection of civilian lives in Gaza, in Palestine, for children not to be dying, for women not to be giving birth without anaesthetic and having C-sections, for young people, for children not to be dying in incubators without oxygen. Yes, for me, that made it imperative.
Do you think Keir Starmer has a moral conscience?
There's no question about the morality of, everybody has a moral compass. There isn't a person who doesn't. How they see fit to execute that morality is an individual issue, which is why we have the mother of all democracies. One of the reasons I'm proud to represent my constituencies, because I can be here and I can argue my point. I've got a platform to try and get to people to change their minds.
If there was an election, in the next few weeks, it would cost Labour votes if they don't shift on this policy.
Maybe it will.
Keir Starmer would justify his policy by saying that Israel has a right to defend itself after the deaths of 1,400 people, the worst atrocity for Jewish people since the Holocaust.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
What Hamas did was a terror act, and I've said that it was an egregious crime against humanity. There is no question about what happened, and I want peace in the Middle East, and I want peace for the Israelis, and I want peace for the Palestinians. There is no question about that. And how we reach that, we have abdicated our responsibility as the UK. We have not, and I've spoken about this for the last 8 years since I've been here, when we've not held Netanyahu to account and his right-wing government to account. That's what we've not done, and we have failed. And I'm looking forward to, hopefully, inshallah, a Labour government so we can start doing that work.
Do you have a broader problem with Keir Starmer's leadership? Because, he's close to Conservative policy on economic policy, for example, not just this issue of foreign policy. Does that concern you?
Right today, all my head is concerned with is trying to get us through this, so I'm not going to comment on the fiscal policies and everything else, or every other policy.
But you back Keir Starmer as leader? This isn't a sort of de facto leadership challenge.
If we go to a general election, I'll be going on a manifesto by the leader of a Labour Party, who is Keir Starmer, unless that was shifted, unless that was changed. And that isn't going to change because we are going to a general election with Keir Starmer.
It doesn't sound like a ringing endorsement.
Well, it's,
this has shaken your confidence in his leadership.
Look, I have made, for me, I have taken a decision. I have taken a decision which is about me, it's about my conscience, it's about what my constituents want. And I have got no doubt that everybody is trying their best. And in Keir's speech in Chatham House, Keir said that he understood why people wanted a ceasefire. And there is something about politics that we have to be able to agree to disagree with respect, and I think that's where we're at.
Naz Shah speaking to me earlier. Well, MPs have been voting on that SNP amendment, calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. They rejected the amendment by 293 to 125. Paul McNamara is with me now. Paul, what can we draw from those numbers?
From those numbers, not so much. Okay, so that amendment hasn't been voted through. What's important here, though, is the Labour rebels. Now, I understand, I think Labour think that there are about 60 rebels in total, but of course what's key for them is the front bench. Senior Labour sources are telling me they believe, at the moment, they're still double-checking because its votes just happened, it looks like 8 shadow ministers and 2 PPSs. Now, we actually
one of them's just behind you.
Yeah, one of them's just yeah. There we go. Now, look, what we haven't had is a whole round of resignations. There's only actually 3 people who have formally resigned. So then the question is, well, what does Keir Starmer do now? I understand from senior Labour sources, they take it as a given. The convention is if you vote against the government on the vote against the party on a 3-line whip on it, as far as they're concerned, you have resigned. So I know
Naz Shah, who's standing just behind you,
and she told you earlier on she wasn't aware of what actually the consequences would be. As far as leadership's concerned, they're out.
I mean, it's a serious blow to Keir Starmer's authority, isn't it, those numbers?
It is, but I was talking to someone earlier on, they were saying, look, as long as we can keep the rebels, the resignations on the front bench down below double figures, we're actually pretty happy with this. So I don't think they're going to be looking at these numbers tonight and being that unhappy. I think a lot of the people included in these numbers they're not household names. They're not those big beasts that are going to create lots of headlines for you. So I think actually Labour are going to be looking at this, bringing a sigh of relief this evening.